Welcome, everyone, and happy Social Work Month. The theme this year, Bringing Change to Life, recognizes and celebrates the difference social workers make in the lives of people, families, and communities across the country and in our province of Newfoundland and Labrador. My name is Annette Johns, and I am the Associate Director of Policy and Practice with the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Social Workers. I have the honor of being the moderator for today's education event titled Sexual Violence Prevention and Outreach in Nunatsiavut, Working with Community and Sexually Violent Offenders Amongst Coastal Labrador's Inuit Population. This is certainly a very timely and important topic. As social workers, we continue to strive to enhance our knowledge and skills in working with people from diverse cultural backgrounds, and this presentation is a wonderful complement to our learning and a great way to start Social Work Month 2018. This webinar is a collaboration between the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Social Workers and the Canadian Association of Social Workers, and it is exciting to note that we have social workers from across the province tuning in today. The webinar presentation will be approximately 60 minutes, followed by 30 minutes of questions and answers a period that I will moderate. So please send in your questions throughout the presentation, and I'll keep track of the questions. Only myself and our presenter will see these questions. All of the housekeeping details you need, like how to access the recording, where to download the slides, and how to get your certificate of attendance are all included in the housekeeping widget that popped up when you first logged in. So I now want to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Laura Moores. Laura is a recent graduate of Memorial University's Bachelor of Social Work program and currently working as a sexual violence prevention and outreach counselor for the Nunatsiavut government in Labrador. She is also currently working with the Mennonite Church of Canada in developing a circle of support and accountability in Nain, as well as a member of the Board of Directors for the Selma Onalik Safe House in Hopedale. Her research interests include community responses to sexual and gender-based violence, harm reduction, and recidivism reduction for sexually violent offenders. So without further ado, I will now pass things over to Laura to begin the presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Hi there. Thanks so much, everybody, for logging in today and taking time out of your busy schedules for this presentation. As Annette said, my name is Laura Moores, and I work for the Nunatsiavut government, which is on the north coast of Labrador. So for today's presentation, the topics that I'm going to be covering are a little bit of background on Nunatsiavut, as well as some of the specific program background and funding information for the program that I work with. The three basic areas of my job involve education and outreach work, service provider skills development, and working with offenders. And with working directly with offenders, that includes circles of support and accountability, also some research and promising practices for working with this population. So before I give any presentation that deals with sexual violence, I always like to take a quick moment to talk about the language that I use. So when I refer to individuals who have experienced sexual violence, I generally refer to them as survivors. But it's very important to know that many people don't identify with that term. We tend to think that that term is the best term to use. It's often seen as preferable to the term victim, but at the same time, it's important to be mindful in practice that someone may identify with survivor, with victim, or with neither of those terms. Likewise, individuals who've been charged with sexual offenses or convicted, I'm going to refer to during this presentation as offenders, but that is not a term that I ever use when I'm working with people one-on-one in practice. It's more for the sake of brevity that I'm going to use those terms, survivor and offenders. So I just like to put that out there in the beginning. So Nunatsiavut is a self-governing Inuit region in Labrador. In Inuktitut, it means our beautiful land. And like I said, it is self-governing. It incorporates 5 communities up on the coast. In 2005 is when Nunatsiavut was actually established. Now, that process of self-governance actually started in the 1970s under the Labrador Land Claims Agreement. Individuals who fall under the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement are referred to as beneficiaries, and they are eligible to avail of a variety of services and benefits through the Nunatsiavut government. So that could include, but are not limited to, education and employment assistance, non-insured health benefits like counseling, fisheries and hunting, harvesting regulations, and a multitude of social programs throughout the region. I also like to show a little map that kind of highlights where I'm actually working from. So in the slightly darker green is where you see the 5 main geographic communities. So that includes, starting from the north to the south, it goes Nain to Hopedale, Postville, Makkovik, and Rigolet. It also includes the Torngat Mountains National Park in the very high north. So that's where most of the offices for Nunatsiavut are located, in these 5 communities, Nain being the largest. Second largest is Hopedale, which is where I live, kind of closer to the middle so I can go up and down. My position is a regional position, so while I am situated in Hopedale, I do travel throughout the coast. As well, Nunatsiavut actually has offices in Happy Valley, Goose Bay, and St. John's, because there is a sizable population of beneficiaries who do not live within the geographic Nunatsiavut communities. So the government itself is kind of broken down into 7 departments. So that includes the Nunatsiavut Secretariat, Nunatsiavut Affairs, Education and Economic Development, Lands and Natural Resources, Culture, Recreation and Tourism, Finance and Human Resources, and the department under which I work, which is Health and Social Development. So the department under Health and Social Development, sometimes called DHSD, we all love our acronyms, but it does a lot of different benefits, a lot of different services. Social programming, mental healing and wellness is the department kind of directly under that, which is where I work. There are services that are provided by Labrador Grenfell Health, which is the local provincial health authority, and there are public health services, but DHSD works generally with them as well to kind of fill some of the gaps. So they look at also home care, dental services, a variety of counseling and support services, and many of them do come under mental healing and wellness, but not all. So the actual specifics about the program, now that we talked a little bit about Nunatsiavut, the program that I work under, a little bit of context is, despite being a relatively small population, Nunatsiavut actually has a fairly high rate of suicide and sexual violence. The rate for suicide, I have in another slide a little image, it's actually about 25 times that of Canada's national average. The rate of sexual and physical violence is actually fairly high in Newfoundland and Labrador in general, but it's even higher on the coast. And recognizing this as a major issue, the Department of Health and Social Development, they applied for funding through Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I am not an Nunatsiavut speaker. But that's under their National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy, and I have included a copy of a PDF of that report. It's actually a really good read. Looks at some of the risk factors for suicide, but also some of the strengths, and kind of outlines a plan. So under that program, they've applied for funding for this position and this program that I do, kind of recognizing the link between sexual violence and doing some prevention work to also have an impact on the suicide prevention strategy. So the suicide prevention strategy, or NIST, it has identified critical risk factors for the Inuit for suicide, and that includes historical trauma of forced relocations, residential schools. There was a mass call and slaughter of dog teams, and the overall impact of colonialism. There's also a risk factor could be early adversity, including physical and sexual abuse, social inequity, including food insecurity, inadequate housing, poverty, and lack of services. Intergenerational trauma of families wounded by violence and suicide, mental illness and substance abuse, and the acute stress of loss, hopelessness, and isolation. ITK, they acknowledge that suicide prevention is quite complex with many contributing factors. So the risk factors listed on this slide all play a part in rates of suicide as well as sexual violence throughout Inuit Nunangat, which is the 4 major Inuit North regions in Canada. So all of these issues are related to social determinants of health, and it can become a self-perpetuating cycle at times. And while it's important to recognize the risk factors for suicide, there's also a lot of protective factors for Inuit in Canada as outlined in this infographic that's actually included in the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy. So many of the protective factors are evident in the communities in Nunatsiavut. So there's a lot of a strong sense of family in the communities in which I work, a lot of cultural pride and continuity, and Nunatsiavut government has actually prioritized these protective factors into their services and programs. So there's a lot of family programs, there's a lot of support programs in the community, culture and heritage. There's a real push for continuing the language of Inuktitut, and that starts at a very young age with even infants and small toddlers. So instead of trying to create all these things, we're kind of building on some of the existing strengths to kind of help mitigate the risk of suicide in the community. A big one that is quite evident is intergenerational trauma. I think many social workers and practitioners are now aware of intergenerational trauma, and mainly a lot of it comes from more knowledge around the impact of residential school survivors. But one thing that I didn't know prior to my move up here was the impact of forced resettlement in Labrador. And specifically what I hear a lot in my communities, a main one was Hebron, which was a northern community that was forcibly resettled in 1959. And, at the time, the stores ended up closing. The health services were pulled from this area, so communities were pretty much, families were pretty much forced to leave. Many of them resettled in Hopedale, but some families did get split up along the coast. And that had a really big impact on people who moved because not only were they, leaving the only homes that they knew and, leaving the graves of family and ancestors behind, but they also lost a lot of their familiarity with the land, which greatly impacted people's ability to hunt and fish and provide for their families. They were also promised, housing, adequate housing, but unfortunately this was often not the case. So they were in very overcrowded homes, 12, 15 people in a one-room home in some cases, sometimes more. And, some families were split up into different communities, and the impact of this resettlement was incredibly traumatic, and many people are still impacted by the reverberations of this trauma today. So there's still a lot of people who kind of acutely feel the effects throughout their families. So that's a little bit of, some of the background context. So prior to me taking this position and after I took the position, there was a lot of consultation with community members, existing staff who work for the Nunatsiavut government, agency partners, and frontline workers. So it was basically determined that the best focus for this program would be in 3 main areas. So that's community education and outreach, service provider skills development, and direct service for sexually violent individuals. So with community education and outreach, pretty much involves me doing presentations and workshops to various community groups. As well, I try to get up every couple of months to the Labrador Correctional Center in Happy Valley Goose Bay. I'm actually going next week and doing some workshops there. And also working on community responses and supports for sexual violence. So working on a couple projects on, putting together some information for individuals on what the reporting process looks like for sexual violence and getting some information together for both service providers and service users. So the discussions that were had, they indicated a very strong need for culturally guided and community-based programming. And the programs that I work on highlight a lot of the strengths and areas of growth in existing programs. So, some of the topics that I've spoken to groups about are, boundaries, abuse prevention and warning signs, safety planning, so if somebody wants to leave an abusive relationship, ways to handle conflict, how do we talk about conflict in interpersonal relationships without it blowing up, development of sustainable coping skills, and consent, so that includes age of consent, laws, how to get consent, how do you know if you have it, that type of a thing. So the workshops are fairly successful, and I'm continuously developing new workshops for new things. So I try to partner with some existing programming in the communities. So here in Hopedale, a really popular one was the parenting support group that they have every week. So generally a meal is provided, and then there's a recreation space for the youth to kind of play under supervision and the kids, while the parents kind of go through a little workshop. So sometimes I'll come in and I'll talk about how to have discussions of consent with children, or I'll talk about boundaries, or how to do a safety plan, things like that. And as I said, I do go into the correctional center to do programming, which is always very popular amongst the individuals incarcerated. And the key is, all about trying to prevent violence as well as having discussions about it, and, kind of starting these conversations to engage the community. And that was identified by the consulted community members and agency partners. I'm also working on, in partnership with Labrador Grenfell Health and some other mental healing and wellness workers in Hopedale, we're working on an adult support group, which will also touch on a lot of these topics. So for service provider skills development, with the consultation with the frontline workers and community groups, they identified that they're much more comfortable working with survivors as opposed to perpetrators of sexual violence, which is pretty understandable. Even, a lot of people, even other professionals, paraprofessionals, social workers, doctors, psychologists that I've spoken with, many of them, first thing they say to me is, I could never work with offenders. But, so that's not unusual. The individuals did identify that even though they're more comfortable working with survivors, they would always welcome additional training. So I actually have developed 2 training workshops to date, which focus on responding to disclosures of sexual violence as well as working with offenders. That will be given, and that's given not only to people who work with Nunatsiavut government, it's open to also some of the safe houses in the region. Their staff can come and take these workshops when I offer them in their areas. A lot of the nurses at the clinics, teachers even, guidance counselors, it's pretty much open for many community members. So for the one specific to responding to disclosures of sexual violence, the aim is to build on existing knowledge of sexual assault trauma and active listening skills. Many of the individuals, they even say afterwards, well, it wasn't brand new information. I knew a lot of what you talked about, but, it was really good to kind of hear, kind of get reinforced that this is like a best practice, or to get more practice in working on these things. Also in this presentation, I talk about secondary wounding and sexual assault trauma specifically, and some of the impacts. So secondary wounding generally refers to when a survivor makes a disclosure of sexual violence. If the response they get is in any way, shaming or blaming of either their being victimized or assaulted to begin with, their response during, or how they cope with it afterwards. That's known as secondary wounding and is quite painful for people. For the workshop on working with perpetrators, the aim is to focus on current thoughts and beliefs and a lot of myths about working with this population, as well as kind of what I'm going to go through today as well, some of the research, promising practices, and outlining principles for this area. So, and like I said, it's provided to a lot of people in the community. So the main bulk of my work actually involves direct work with offenders. So I do provide direct counseling work with individuals convicted of sexual offenses. The goal of the work is to actually reduce the recidivism rates and prevent future offending. So I get my referrals through probation officers here on the coast, the Correctional Center from Department of Health and Social Development where I work. Labrador Grenfell Health can also send me referrals, and I have received a couple of self-referrals of people who've had convictions in the past and want to work on some issues, which is always amazing. Unfortunately, majority of my clients are mandated, which in and of itself has some considerations, but when you get a self-referral, it's awesome. And you know, this area of social work practice, as already discussed, it can sometimes be seen as controversial. Many people, first thing they say is, why are we using precious resources to work with offenders when we already have such limited supports to work with survivors? And I always counter that, you know, of course we need more support for survivors, absolutely. You know, the impacts of sexual violence and sexual assault trauma are enormous. And, you know, I don't feel that we could really ever have sufficient services for that. That being said, though, my area of work involves prevention, and preventing people from being victimized in the future is the main goal of this work, and, you know, something that I'm extremely passionate about. So one part of working with offenders involves the development of a circle of support and accountability in Maine. This is also something that I was very interested in when I was doing my bachelor degree. Did a lot of research on this topic. So I'm actually currently working in consultation with the Mennonite Church of Canada. They're looking at setting up a circle in Maine, and it's basically a community-based programming that really has a lot of research and support behind it to show the potential to reduce recidivism rates. And the image on this slide, it outlines the basic structure of a COSA. So the offender is the little person in yellow, and they're referred to as a core member. And then there's an inner circle, which involves the volunteers who they receive a lot of training in supporting the offender, and they're shown in blue in the little circle right outside. And this was how the original circles kind of operated. They've evolved a little bit since to include a little lady there in purple is the circle coordinator. That person actually is the person who's responsible for doing a lot of the volunteer recruitment and training, selection of the core member and trying to find the right fit for them. As well, there's an outer circle of little people in green, professionals. And these usually involve, you know, people in the field of law enforcement or probation or parole, health professionals, elders in the community, and people who also volunteer their time, and they're available to support the inner circle as needed. So, you know, if an inner circle had a situation where that they were concerned about a core member's behavior or some of the things that have been coming up, they would usually consult with the circle coordinator, who would then bring it to the outer circle and, you know, if they wanted to consult. So I'm actually hoping to act in the role of one of the outer circle members and, you know, do some work with the church in, they're actually in Goose Bay right now is where their office is, but, you know, I've had a few meetings with them, so. So as I said, it actually was initially developed by the Mennonite Church in Canada in Ontario in the mid-90s. COSAs actually follow 4 basic principles, and they're no one is disposable, no one does this alone, no more victims, and community is responsible for its victims and those who offend against them. So there are a lot of elements of restorative justice and risk reduction and risk management, and they're commonly found in all COSAs. While it was developed by the Mennonite Church in Canada and the current one is still with the Mennonite Church, it's actually been adopted by multiple agencies internationally. So there are circles in Scotland and the UK and Wales. There's the Department of Corrections in Minnesota actually uses the COSA model. In Newfoundland and Labrador, I believe Turnings, I don't know if they have current circles right now, but they've done a lot of circles of support and accountabilities. So it's by no means a faith-based thing. There are a lot of secular organizations who do this as well. And they're actually considered quite successful and at very low cost to implement because the majority of work is actually done with volunteers. So the inner circle are all volunteers, and the outer circle are volunteers as well. The only paid position really is the circle coordinator. So at this stage in Maine, I believe we're still looking for a circle coordinator and recruiting volunteers at this time. So, and if anybody has any questions, because this kind of was an area that I have lots and lots and lots of literature on, you know, you can always email me or message me, and I can give you a lot of information on this. It's a really great program. I think it should be all over the country, even more so than it is now. So with regarding to working with offenders, you know, it does have its own considerations. So it is an area of practice that doesn't have as much research as practice with some other populations that social workers work with. There's also some issues with some of the programs that used to be historically used. So in psychology and social work until, you know, probably the mid-90s even. There is, though, a lot of new research that identifies how to best work with these service users. And, you know, when I first started my position here, you know, my director and a lot of people in the department, like we said that, you know, I'm only going to be working with offenders, not offenders and survivors, with my one-on-one work. And some community members, you know, they ask why, and basically it's due to issues with the community sizes, because the community sizes are small. I believe Rigolette is, I don't know if it's 300 people or 150, and Nain is the largest with about 1,400 people. So if I'm going to be working with offenders and survivors, there's going to be a lot of overlap and possibly an issue with a conflict of interest. So that coupled with many of the service providers' comfort level with already working with survivors, I just explained to them that at this point we're going to be providing more training on, you know, for them to help work with survivors, but right now I'll be working with offenders only. So, and as I stated, many of the programs that professionals had used previously were found to be problematic. Programming, a lot of the programming was not developed with many key goals in mind, and this sometimes led to instances where groups were run, and this was often in correctional facilities, without a clear moderator or facilitator. Many of the previous programs were found to have little or no positive effect on recidivism rates, and in some cases, participants had even worse recidivism rates than those who did not attend programming. So, you know, there's definitely more of a push now to have, you know, more research-based, evidence-based practice involved in this line of work. And whenever I do this presentations on this type of work, I always like to talk about some of the really common myths surrounding this area of practice. The ones that I hear a lot are, you know, sex offenders are always high risk to reoffend. They all require very intensive intervention. Nothing will work to reduce recidivism, or, you know, we should have hardline approaches here in Canada, such as public registries and notification laws like they do in the States. That's the best way to keep society safe. I know every now and then I get friends who send me a Facebook page and say, oh, look, this is telling me how many sex offenders live in my area. And I'm like, none of them are official. In Canada, we only have private registries, which means the police and law enforcement have access to where a sex offender is living at any given time. But unless it was something in the media and people literally can put a face to a name, there's no official registry that's public in Canada. And that's kind of a good thing because, as I'm going to go into in the next slides, the research that has been published actually refutes all of these statements. So I find it really valuable to look at the common misconceptions and kind of counter them with some of the research on, work with sex offenders. So not only are the firmly held beliefs entrenched in the minds of the general public, but I've met some service providers and people in other helping professions that also hold these beliefs. So it's a really good conversation to have to kind of talk about some of the myths. So the first point, which is that sex offenders are always at high risk to reoffend. So while there are certain cases where people remain high risk for their lives, it's actually not true for the vast majority of sex offenders at any risk level. So there was a recent study that's a quite larger scale study, so over 7,700 sex offenders, and it's a longitudinal study, so for 20 years these individuals were followed, that even the majority of even the high-risk offenders had reduced their rates of reoffending the longer they desisted from offending. So the key is we need to keep them from offending as long as we can, because the longer that they go, the lower their rates go. Also, sex offenders are regularly found to have lower recidivism rates than non-sexual offenders. So an individual who's in for another crime, whether it be like assault or property theft or what have you, they generally have higher rates of reoffending than sex offenders do. And in fact, recidivism rates for people who desist from offending, they're found to be halved for every 5 years that a high-risk offender desists from reoffending. So if there's an offender who, when they release from prison, their recidivism rate is predicted to be like 24%. After 5 years, it usually drops to 12%. After another 5 years, it drops to 6%. So it does drop significantly. Offenders are also, statistically speaking, generally young, male, and known to the victims. I know a lot of people, this is probably going to age myself when I say this, but are familiar with the whole stranger danger push that was in the 80s and 90s. So stranger danger is, good information for kids to know, but unfortunately, especially people who may have worked with survivors, we tend to hear very similar stories of people who are known to the offender, usually trusted to them. And it's also really interesting to note that the majority of offenders are actually youth and young. So rates of sexual assault were actually higher for youth than they are for adults. So a youth is more likely to be convicted of a sex offense than an adult is. It also points to the importance of tailoring treatment needs provided to the offender. So, we really need to look at providing appropriate services to all offenders, youth and adults. But, I always find that interesting, that a statistic that a lot of them are youth, because I think many people kind of get the feeling that it's like a creepy old man in an alley somewhere. They don't really think that it could be their sons or nephews or brothers or anything like that, and that we really need to kind of look at how we provide services and treatment to these individuals. And also, youth sex offenders also have lower recidivism rates than youth offenders of other crimes, much like the adults as in the previous slide. So the point where, all of them require intensive treatment is also not accurate. So obviously, I don't think anyone would be surprised if I say that minimal treatment for a high-risk offender can actually increase the risk of reoffending. But also, it has what's known as an iatrogenic effect. So if I provide intensive treatment to somebody who is low risk, that will also increase the risk of reoffending. So instead of providing, really intensive treatment to everybody regardless of risk level, that can actually increase somebody's risk to reoffend. If they're already at a low rate, it could drive them up to a medium or a high rate to reoffend. So I always find that that's really interesting, and it kind of points to the need for a really reflexive and tailored approach to working with offenders. So we do need to meet them at their unique needs. So a really popular one is regarding public registries and notification laws. So research reports that with the private registries that we have in Canada, these actually do work fairly well and can actually reduce reoffending rates, can really help police and other law enforcement officials with locating individuals charged with sex offenses. Public registries, on the other hand, and notification laws often lead to increased rates of reoffending. And I know a lot of people get surprised when I say that. And basically, there's a few reasons why they believe this is the case. Pretty much offenders end up choosing different types of victims as opposed to not offending again. So if somebody was offending against a family member or somebody who was really close to them, they may end up doing an offense on like a person, like a child that they see at the park. Or if it involves a contact offense that someone has where, they actually are physically in contact with the person, instead of offending that way, they may actually do a non-contact offense, which involves looking at child pornography or could involve exposure, that type of a thing. So it kind of just changes the victims that they choose, as well as sometimes the actual type of violence that they perpetrate. Another reason that this public registries can increase the rates of reoffense is that there's usually a lot of noncompliance when compared with private registries. To avoid community backlash, a lot of people will drop off the radar as opposed to complying with it. There's also a significant amount of increased psychological, social, and financial distress on offenders, which has been linked to increased barriers for them to desist and live an offense-free life. So, it's not about offender hugging, as I like to call it. It's more about, okay, how are we going to adequately integrate this person back in society in a safe way and provide them with the tools that they need to live a life where they are not offending. As well, when we look at many of the states that require registration, public registration, and notification laws, many of the states, because they're not in Canada but they're in the United States, they've reported that these programs are very burdensome and expensive to administer. So it's using resources that could be used elsewhere. They're kind of taking these resources on something that may actually increase rates to reoffend. So when we are working with offenders, and I'm going to go into this a little bit in detail, is, what does work when working with offenders? Because there's a lot of people say, well, we don't know what works. And it's we don't know 100% what works all the time, but we know kind of what overall tends to lead to decreased recidivism rates. So the first point is accepting the person and not their crime as they are, and that can be really, really hard. It does not involve condoning the behavior or crime whatsoever, but accepting the person. Identifying patterns of behavior is also key. So, for example, was alcohol a factor? Does the offender have addictions issues? Is there a pattern behind their offending behavior? Does it happen seasonally? Is there something that kind of triggers this? Is it when a person is out of work or unemployed? What are some of the patterns, especially if it's a repeat offender, behind their offending? Improving overall mental health is always a goal. So, this is very, very important. Many individuals can have underlying trauma that they want to discuss during their sessions. There could be issues with anxiety, that type of a thing. So that's another thing that I tend to work on with my clients, and that the literature supports. Adapting a modified relapse prevention strategy is also really important. And the reason I say modified is because I know a lot of the relapse prevention strategies and kind of how we look at addictions and the cycle of change and all that, it usually involves relapse is sometimes seen as not necessarily inevitability, but a normal part of the process of recovery. Obviously, in this case, we want to avoid relapse at all possible because of the enormous costs. So that's why I say a modified relapse prevention strategy. Again, providing appropriate levels of care. Low-risk offender gets gets less treatment or intensity than somebody who is considered high risk. There's also social supports is also really big. Many of the individuals many offenders have some issues with social skills. So enhancing social supports and modeling appropriate pro-social skills is very, very important. Safety planning is also key. What are the early warning signs that may lead to offending behavior? What are things the offender can do to stop things from getting worse? What are people that they can support? Who are they can support? That type of a thing. Let me see. Early intervention is really important as well. So, and that involves, again, providing appropriate support and treatment to offenders early on. It can often prevent offending behaviors from getting worse. So working with offenders, what works is there has been some literature that really focuses on the role of counselors. So a strong therapeutic relationship is really key to providing effective sexual offense treatment. They've actually looked at some of the characteristics that counselors have and what has been linked to the reduced reoffending, and that involves empathy, respect, sincerity, confidence, and interest in the client. It's also really important for counselors to celebrate small changes early in the process and to help a client establish a strong, trusting relationship. The main thing, and it kind of goes into what doesn't work, is trying to keep an individual to continue to participate in programming and treatment or counseling. So what doesn't work is we need to look at what are considered criminogenic needs when working with offenders, and that's kind of a little bit of jargon that a lot of psychologists or criminologists identify. So a criminogenic need is basically anything that kind of supports somebody offending. A non-criminogenic need is something that has little to no impact on it at all. So what they found in the research that doesn't work is forcing an individual to own up to their crimes, sessions involving a lot of details about the offense, developing empathy for survivors, confronting denial or minimization, and excessive shaming. And that's actually quite surprising for a lot of people. And I got to be honest, when I first was reading literature, it made me a little uncomfortable. But, when I've kind of looked at the literature on this, if none of them have shown any evidence of reducing an individual's risk to reoffend, these kind of having these really hard-line approaches, like so forcing someone to own up to their crimes and accept accountability, that may actually make them more resistant to coming to talk. So I kind of had to examine my own discomfort with it and kind of reconcile that. So the key, like I said, is to prevent further people from being victimized. And while it may be really difficult to work with an individual who's resistant to counseling, by establishing a strong relationship and being empathetic to the individual and not their crime, will increase their want to continue counseling and reduce the risk to the general public. So it may feel really good to have a perpetrator take accountability for the crime and develop empathy for their victims. This is really something that cannot be, it cannot come from the outside. It cannot be enforced in a meaningful way in a therapeutic relationship. It's something that many offenders eventually reconcile and develop on their own. And it's much more meaningful for them to kind of come to these conclusions on their own instead of having somebody kind of shove it down their throat, which understandably, many of us feel that that's what we would like to do in many cases. But, it's really much more meaningful to kind of develop that and let it occur naturally. So research also shows that sex offenders are at a much higher risk to reoffend when they quit treatment than those who continue and complete. So that's why it's really, really important that treatment be engaging and motivating to encourage them to complete the treatment to the best of their ability. A big part of working with offenders involves reporting. So obviously there are times when working with them that you have to report certain behavior to other authorities. So there's the standard limits of confidentiality that we all have, but many of the clients are also mandated to attend sex offender recidivism reduction therapy, is I believe the wording that I've seen a lot on probation reports. So it's usually a requirement of them being on probation that they have to come talk to me or, attend telephone sessions. So this in and of itself can prove to be a challenge because many of the clients tend to be, they're not really coming of their own volition a lot of the times. And how I kind of handle reporting, because it's very important to discuss issues of reporting to probation or other authorities while also discussing the standard limits of confidentiality. So in an introductory session, I would, before we even start, tell people what we're going to be talking about, but, how it's private other than, risk of harm to yourself, anyone else, anybody, any abuse involved under the age of 16, or if I get subpoenaed from a judge. But also, if they are mandated to see me, I tell them right then and there that, your participation in this is also really, really important. And if we don't actually have, if I can't get a hold of you or you're missing appointments constantly, and, that's something I have to report. Also, I do at the end, if somebody is mandated, I usually do a little letter and state, how many appointments the person attended, that they've attended sufficiently, or if their participation was good, and that goes in their file for if they have to go back to court. So what is reported and what is not reported is really important. So, I don't report details about the sessions. That's not disclosed to probation unless it's something relevant. So if somebody discloses to me that they're offending, obviously that would have to be disclosed. But participation is pretty much the big one that I would report to probation or the authorities. Any details about sessions without, the written consent of the offender would have to be subpoenaed by a judge. So, yes, so that kind of clues up basically some of the program backgrounds and a lot of the work that I'm doing. So, working with offenders, it provides us with one of the best opportunities to prevent future victimization in instances of sexual violence from being perpetrated. So while this work can be uncomfortable for many individuals, it's an incredibly valuable and fulfilling area of social work practice. And Nunatsiavut's program to combat sexual violence will not only help offenders, but also the entire community and enhance public safety. So this work combined with training, outreach, and education will definitely help create safer communities and hopefully help to prevent future instances of suicide as well as sexual violence from occurring. I've had a couple community members, they ask, because, full disclosure, I'm not Inuit myself. I am a settler. I did move here for this position, and I've had people ask me, why did you come to Labrador? And the first thing I said was, I honestly, as soon as I saw the job posting, I was really excited because it's like this is a very progressive, awesome program, recognizing this need in the community and wanting to have it. So I got really excited, and I feel really honored to have come here and to kind of do some of this work. And I really feel strongly that provincially, federally, all over the country, internationally even, we should be having more programs similar to this. So that's pretty much my final thoughts on the presentation today. And I was just wondering if anybody had any questions.
Okay, hi. Thanks so much, Laura. My goodness, a fabulous presentation, lots of great information. So we will now open the session up to questions and answers, and we'll certainly do our best to get to all the questions. And if not, then we'll certainly have a look at those following the session. But we've had several questions come in, Laura, so I'm just going to throw some of these out to you. One of our participants wondered if you could elaborate a bit on the slide, the research slide, around the fact that extensive treatment for someone who is low risk can actually increase the risk to reoffend. Just some more information on that.
Yes. Yep. They've actually found that a lot of the research that has come out of it is that, not only do we need to be aware that providing minimal treatment to somebody who's high risk could really increase their recidivism rates, but they have found that providing very intensive treatment for low-risk offenders will also, in many cases, increase their risk of reoffending. They don't know 100% why this is the case. It could be, especially if it involves kind of group counseling. Sometimes it can kind of, and this is actually, I've seen this in other research working with other offending populations, so not just sex offenders, that sometimes it almost provides like a networking thing for somebody who may be low risk, to kind of talk with individuals kind of about some of the things that they offend. Sometimes it can kind of amp up, especially if people are talking in really graphic detail about experiences. But also, sometimes a lot of treatment that is provided to offenders can kind of be disruptive to their lives. So if somebody has to see me 3 days a week and get off of work, that can cause increased burden on them. They tend to be focusing on things that maybe they don't really need to be focusing on because they're considered low risk to reoffend. And that can actually drive up their rates of reoffending. I don't know if I answered that.
Thank you. So a follow-up to that question is what kinds of treatments would be included in an intensive treatment intervention?
Yeah. So it goes beyond, for an intensive treatment, it could involve like a day programming where people actually go in every day. It depends on the region and the services available. There are also sometimes there's some psychiatric involvement, so a lot of times there's medication that can be prescribed to individuals. Intensive counseling, so group or one-on-one. So an individual who I see, like if I were to see an individual who's considered high risk, that would be somebody that I would need to see minimum once a week, sometimes maybe twice or 3 times a week, and we really need to talk about, a lot of the patterns behind offending. A lot of it is cognitive behavioral therapy based. So, kind of talking about what's going on and their thoughts and feelings and that type of a thing. These are kind of more involved with intensive, whereas somebody who's considered low risk, maybe in the beginning we'll talk once a week, more to check in to see how they're coping with stress, to see what they want to work on. So if it's social skills, getting involved in community events, that type of a thing. So it really does vary depending on the individual's needs.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just a reminder for people to keep your questions coming in because we do have some time for those questions. Another question came from one of your former BSW classmates, and it's a 2-part question. First of all, the person was very happy to see you doing this today, but the questions are in terms of what are the biggest challenges for you in working directly with offenders in the community, and also what is the term that you prefer to use as opposed to offenders?
Yeah, so when I'm referring, usually I just refer to people one-on-one by their name, as I think most of us do. But if I'm kind of referring to it as a population, usually say, individuals who have been convicted of a sexual offense is kind of the, I guess, most innocuous term, I would say. But that's the term that I would use. It's just for the point of this presentation, I'd probably still be only halfway through if I use that term halfway through. So, to keep things a little more concise, I use the term offenders. And I'm sorry, what was the first part of that question? I just missed that.
Yeah, the first part is in terms of what you see as the biggest challenges for you in working directly with offenders in the community.
Yeah, so a lot of the issues that I see kind of coming up in my work generally have to do with trauma, whether that be intergenerational or personal historical experiences of trauma, or individual, what someone experienced in their own life. Also, a lot of times, and this is common with many regions, is issues sometimes with alcohol use being involved. And as well, I mean, anywhere on the coast, I believe with many situations that there is not as many services as in rural. It's very rural, and not only rural, it's remote up here on the coast. So, access to services like psychiatry services are much, much harder up here to kind of get in to see somebody. So those definitely are some of the issues. Like I said, there is a lot of community events and a lot of supports actually in relatively small communities all throughout Nunatsiavut. So that kind of definitely helps take some, provide some people with some ability to practice social skills in a safe way and comfortable way for them. Not always comfortable, but in at least a safe way. So there's different events people can kind of go to in different groups and stuff like
that. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Great questions coming in. Another question is, are there certain criteria that have to be met for individuals to be involved in the program?
The only criteria that an individual has to be involved, to speak with me and do counseling with me or programming, is they have to be a beneficiary. So they have to be a beneficiary in Nunatsiavut, and generally have displayed sexually violent behavior. So whether that be a conviction or a charge, or somebody self-identifies as, in the past, some of my former relationships were not the healthiest and may have had some violence in there. The majority of people, though, and this is kind of universal, nobody really says, yes, I'm a sex offender right off the bat. So I'm actually quite surprised when I do receive self-referrals, but happily so. It does tend to be people, though, who are involved in the criminal justice system, but that's by no means the only way people can see me. As long as you're a beneficiary of Nunatsiavut and, you've got sexual violence issues as a perpetrator, they can come see me. That's the only criteria.
Okay. Thank you. And would this capture spousal sexual violence as well?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely it does. A lot of people, when they think of domestic abuse or, interrelational abuse, they tend to not really consider sexual violence in there. But that's actually, and a lot of the work I do with the safe houses, that's why they want to come and get the training, because a lot of times, unfortunately, they do go hand in hand. So if somebody has sexually assaulted a spouse, whether they've been charged for it or not, if they wanted to self-refer to me and they're a beneficiary, absolutely, that's something I would deal with, because many times, like I said, a lot of the perpetrators are known to the victims, and that includes husbands and wives.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. In terms of the slide on secondary wounding, what are some of the tips you would share with people to prevent secondary wounding as part of your presentation?
Yeah, there's quite a few of them. A big thing I always tell people is a huge part of it is just listening, and listening engaged. So, having open body posture, practicing a lot of the active listening skills. But a big thing is I even give out helpful phrases to use when somebody makes a disclosure. And, I've done a lot of volunteer work prior to this position with the Sexual Assault Center in St. John's, which is a fabulous organization that provides crisis information and support line. And, I really drew on a lot of that experience from my training with them as well, in that, it's really, it almost sounds kind of cliche that when you say, I believe you, It's not your fault. It sounds kind of like a cliche, like, oh, that really doesn't make a difference. But those two phrases can actually have a life-changing effect on people. And when you see someone's face or you hear like them kind of like let out a big breath, it's a huge relief. So, just being really mindful of the language you use. I always say don't ask why questions. Why were you there? Why did you do that? Why did they do this? That type of a thing, and really avoiding victim blaming. Even being honest with people and just saying right up front, oh, that's a lot, and I don't even know what to say, but I'm going to do my best to support you, and is there anything I can do to help you feel safer right now? These are all things that I find are really good ways to kind of talk with a survivor without perpetuating secondary wounding. Some of it, unfortunately, even comes from the media. Especially now with like the Me Too movement in the media and some of the backlash that movement has been facing, unfortunately, and we can't necessarily change what happens in the media, but we can challenge these things. Some people can get triggered by, news reports of, the Stanford swimmer as opposed to a rapist being described as, a championship swimmer and a college student. It can be pretty upsetting to somebody who's a survivor to hear stuff like that. So, just being really mindful is a huge part of what I'd recommend.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Another question is around services that are available for offenders that are still incarcerated. Mm-hmm. What services are currently available?
Currently used in a lot of the institutions. There's not a huge amount of services per se. I guess my point is that I think there always needs to be more services. But right now there's a model that's being used in many Canadian correctional facilities called the Good Lives model. And which is a really amazing program that kind of looks at key areas in an offender's life to help them live, a good offense-free life and feel fulfilled. And it's a pretty intensive program. It's a great program. It follows a lot of the principles called the risk, needs, responsivity principles, which involve tailoring the needs based on risk and the needs of the offender and responding to that. So there's quite a bit of research on Good Lives and similar programming, but that's a big one that's being used now. Previously, kind of historically, it used to be a lot of group, and this is a group programming as well, but there used to be a lot of kind of group counseling going on, but there was no real facilitator, so it was kind of inmates kind of getting together as a group and some of them challenging each other and that type of a thing. Pretty much all programming should have some key goals being met and, some key things to be working on and strengths to build upon, as opposed to kind of letting them go kind of willy-nilly with no real end in sight. That's where they found a lot of problems with them in the past. But, yeah, the Good Lives model is really big. In Ontario, I believe it's called the Rockwood Centre, is also really big on kind of using a lot of the similar principles. So I believe there's a book called A Positive Approach to Sex Offender Treatment, and that provides residential as well, I believe, like kind of more intensive day services for individuals convicted of sexual offenses.
Fantastic. Keep your questions coming, guys. We did have a comment come in that just note a fantastic presentation, Laura, and thanks for the presentation. Another question around in terms of what are some of the clinical interventions that you found to be most successful in working with sex offenders?
Yeah, a big part of it is recognizing the patterns of behavior. So, like if somebody found that it happens seasonally when they're unemployed at a certain time, or they're really stressed financially, or they're stressed because of the death of a loved one, that type of a thing, kind of looking at, okay, this is, 3 times when these circumstances happened are when, the offending occurred. And a lot of people who I talk to are resistant to talking about the actual offenses themselves, which is fine, because really kind of going into a lot of detail on that is actually not helpful. But, I always say to people, okay, we don't need to talk about the offense, but I'm just curious what was going on in your life around that time, and kind of developing that, and, what I call it a safety plan even. Like, I'm like, okay, you've said it happens when you drink or when you're hanging around friends or what. So, if the person is not really ready to completely abstain from drinking, what can we do? Like, who's a safe person you can reach or contact if you have been drinking and you realize, oh, I've drank a little more than I expected, or maybe I need a friend to kind of keep an eye on me when I'm at a party, things like that. It really does depend on the individual. A big thing is also developing what I refer to as sustainable coping mechanisms. I'm pretty deliberate in language that I use in general, and I find that we talk a lot about healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms, and I personally like to say the word sustainable, because I find, especially for people who've relied on a coping mechanism for their whole lives, they can get pretty offended if you say that's not a healthy coping mechanism. So usually what I say is, what's sustainable? Like, whether it be self-injury or substance use or whatever, eventually it gets to a point where that can cause some damage, or you might not be able to do that every day of your life. But, what's something that we can kind of do that may give you the same effect that you can do every single day and not have an issue with, or it won't be as destructive to your life or interfere with your daily life. So, developing these sustainable coping skills and kind of identifying, like I said, patterns of behavior, coping skills, safety planning. I'm also a huge fan of wellness recovery action plans for anybody. I've even sat friends down and we've gone through them. So, like, what are some of the early warning signs, and what are some things we can kind of do to kind of stop things from going the way they've traditionally gone? So these are all things that I find to be really, really helpful in my one-on-one work.
Excellent, and just so important around the language, using the word sustainable. That's really good.
Yeah, it's definitely a minefield, language can be, so.
Exactly, yes. In terms of determining if an offender is low or high risk to reoffend, how do we go about looking at that?
So what's used frequently, there's a lot of what they call actuarial assessment models that are used internationally. In Canada, we tend to use what's called the Static 99 or the Static 2002R. This is actually done prior to an individual being released. It's one of the many assessment tools that they use for kind of gauging and determining an individual's risk to reoffend. So based on a number of questions, and they've actually been found to be fairly accurate at accurately predicting risk in most cases. So, it looks at, previous offenses, some of the information around who they've chosen to victimize. So was it somebody who was known to them? Was it somebody who was, a youth? That type of a thing. Was it an unrelated victim? They also look at the age that the offender, had their offense, because these all play a role in determining whether someone is, low to very low, medium, and then there's high or extremely high risk to reoffend. They kind of range. But yeah, the Static 99 or 2002R, I think they use the 2002R, but they're fairly similar to the 99R. These are tools that are used in correctional institutions, generally by, I believe, the classification officers before they get released. And I think some probation can also do them as well, and parole.
Okay. Fabulous. Thank you so much. And I guess people can look up those tools online.
Yes.
Are they available? Yeah.
You can look up the assessment tools. I believe it's the static99r.ca or .com. And it has you can get training on them, on how to actually give them yourself. A lot of psychologists and social workers and probation and parole do this training. and it's offered through a bunch of different organizations. A really big one is the Global Institute, GIFR, Forensic Research, GIFR. So they do a lot of webinars-based training, and you can actually get certified in how to use these assessment tools. There's also ones called the Stable or the Bar. Like there's a bunch of different ones, but the Static 99R and 2002R are the ones that are primarily done in Canada.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. Just a couple more questions. In terms of measuring the success of your work, how do you do that?
Yeah, so that's done in
the outreach work.
Oh, right, of the outreach work? Okay, yeah, because, individual ones can be hard because, I would have to, I think, follow people for a long time. But for the outreach work that I do, so because it is funded through ITK, I do work one-on-one with a consultant who works for ITK on kind of developing kind of assessments. And so at the end of every presentation I give, we do a learning needs assessment. It's a structured questionnaire where it measures what someone's confidence level was prior to the workshop on selected topics and what it is immediately after. So has there been any change, any meaningful change, that type of a thing. These are done whenever I do either service provider skills training or community outreach and engagement. So that's kind of what we're using. And, lots of Excel spreadsheets, which are, not my forte, but something that I'm becoming a little bit more proficient in the longer I go in working with it. But, yeah, we kind of work one-on-one fairly closely. So before I do, a new presentation, we'll kind of go through the needs assessment or the learning assessments and kind of, pick out in the best language, that type of a thing. So it's fairly clear what I'm trying to measure here. And then, we go from there. I also do have, for a lot of, especially the more formal workshops, I also have a registration form, which they can kind of sign at the bottom where it gives me permission to contact them in the future. So probably in the next 6 months or so, I'm going to kind of be looking back at some of the people who indicated. I don't know what their needs assessment was because that's a separate form that's anonymous. But I can ask them, how have you found the workshop? Have you been using any of the skills that you've learned? Do you find that you needed more information on a particular topic, that type of a thing? So that's how we're kind of going right now to measure the success.
Okay, fabulous. Earlier, in an earlier slide, you had noted, around the intergenerational trauma and the forced resettlement. What are some of the other common issues that service users generally struggle with?
Right. Yeah, there's some, forced resettlement and intergenerational trauma are obviously really, really big ones. Substance use can be an issue as well. So, alcohol use is more the big one you see on the coast. Whenever I do, an intake assessment and, if we ask about drugs that people use, they generally, it's alcohol or marijuana is primarily used on the coast. They usually refer to anything else as goose bay drugs. So they're not as, they do happen, but not as frequently. But that's some of the issues. Sometimes there's also, individualized trauma, so not necessarily intergenerational or historical trauma, but their own personal trauma narratives. Some issues with mental healing and wellness, that type of a thing. So somebody may have, a depression diagnosis or an anxiety disorder. Now, obviously, I don't diagnose anybody, but, they may have had a diagnosis previously, so sometimes we talk about coping skills, that type of a thing, on those issues as well. But, the biggest one I would say, though, is intergenerational trauma is hugely evident up here on the coast. Not necessarily with everybody, because there's also a lot of resilience that you see in people, and it's really good to be able to build on those existing strengths and existing resiliency. So, that's a really rewarding part. So I always like to say, I don't want to paint a picture that it's all terrible, because there's also some really amazing work that the communities are doing for themselves, and there's a lot of strength, and there's a lot of sense of, cultural pride and family connection and community connection that, like I always say to people, I'm a townie, I'm from St. John's, and I'm used to Newfoundlanders always saying hello to each other, but here you not only say hello if you're driving on a skidoo to work, you have to wave at every single person you see. There's a big sense, and people, get curious, say, oh, I haven't seen you around, are you a teacher, that type of a thing. People kind of know what's going on in the communities, and there's a lot of strength and community connection.
Excellent. We have one final question, unless other people want to still type in some questions. You still have some time if there's other questions that you do want to ask. Because you work with the Nunatsiavut government, how does the Nunatsiavut government incorporate cultural practices and traditions into their programming?
Yeah, there's actually a good amount of it that's incorporated. So I believe I touched on earlier, there's, a big focus on language and cultural events, but there's also really awesome programming that's what they call land-based programming. So connection to land is very, very important to many of the individuals that I work with and many Nunatsiavut beneficiaries. So, they have, like in most communities, they have a healing lodge or a campsite that they can go to, or there's programming where, they'll take people ice fishing for a day, or let's go pick berries, or a women's sewing circle is really, really popular. I joined it just so I could learn how to sew, but it's really, there's a lot of work done because you hear a lot of stories when people get comfortable and they're just sewing and doing some beadwork, and they'll start to talk. So it's really amazing. I'm a huge fan of the land-based programming, and there's one specifically for the youth. I believe it's called Going Off, Going Strong, because they refer to going off on the land as going off, which bit of a language barrier from Newfoundland. Going off means going off the head and getting angry. So when I first heard that, I was like, oh. But going off, going strong, which is, a lot of youth will go out and go fishing or hunting and kind of learn some of the cultural practices. And, whenever I have a client and we have an appointment and they call me and say, I really wanted to go fishing today, I'm like, that is amazing for your mental health. And if you're able to go fishing, you should absolutely go fishing. That's awesome. I'm never going to, call probation just because somebody wants to, go fishing or hunting or wooding, what they call when they go chop down trees and get firewood. Because it's a huge impact on people's mental health.
Mm-hmm. Wow, sounds like you're doing some fascinating and rewarding work for sure.
Oh, yeah, I absolutely love it up here. So.
Yeah. How long have you been up there now?
I moved up here in August, and like I said, I am a townie, so I had to, sell my car in St. John's and buy a skidoo when I moved up here. So the learning curve has been a little steep. I'm surprised with how much I've adapted with the extreme cold, but it's not too bad, and I even found when I came back home for Christmas, I got really irritated by the traffic at home because here there's no real traffic, so... But yeah, no, it's a lovely spot, beautiful place to come visit, and the people are absolutely fabulous, and you hear a lot of amazing stories of, like I said, strength and resilience, and I'm really honored to be up here and doing this line of work.
Yeah, sounds excellent. I just had a scan through. I don't see any additional questions coming in. So at this point, I just want to take the opportunity to thank Laura for this stellar presentation and for sharing her knowledge and experience with us today. As social workers, it's so wonderful when we can come together to celebrate our profession and to learn from one another. I also want to thank Kyla DeBoer, who is the Labrador-Grenfell Rep on the NLASW Board of Directors, for arranging this with us today. There are so many wonderful examples of social workers bringing change to life across Newfoundland and Labrador, and Laura's work is certainly one of them. So thank you, Laura, for this wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you for having me and listening, and saying in Inuktitut Nakumek is thank you. So thank you so much.
Oh, wonderful. So as you know, the NLASW did produce standards for cultural competence in social work practice in 2016, and Laura's presentation certainly highlighted the importance of being culturally competent in our work, and I certainly learned a lot from today's session, which I'm sure everyone online did as well. So thank you again, Laura. Your presentation was truly appreciated. Again, just to note that the recording of this presentation, the slides, and the resource that Laura talked about will be uploaded to the NLASW website for your reference. And the NLASW Standards for Cultural Competence in Social Work Practice can be accessed on the NLASW website, www.nlasw.ca. For those of you who've been on the line for the past 75 minutes or more, confirmation of attendance is available by clicking on the yellow icon at the bottom right of your window. And I also encourage everyone to complete the evaluation form and provide us with your feedback. So thanks again, everyone, and I wish everyone a wonderful Social Work Month, and I hope you are able to take in many of the other events that we have planned for the month. But really, to Laura for kickstarting Social Work Month 2018 with this wonderful, wonderful presentation with such great information and things that are exciting things that sounds like is happening in the community and with the Nunatsiavut government. So thank you so much, Laura, for sharing that.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, everyone.
Pleasure.
Well, yes, it's ours too, Laura. So on that note, we will sign off, and again, thank you everyone for your participation today and for those great questions that were coming in. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Bye.